Your brain monitors subtle patterns in reality, not just chemicals. We think of immunity as big battles, massive inflammation flares against invaders. But your microglia, the tiny immune sentinels living inside your CNS, are actually exquisitely tuned antennae. They don't wait for catastrophic failure. They are continuously assessing the quality and coherence of your entire environment. It is like how a highly sensitive radar detects not just an object, but the subtle wobble in its trajectory. When those environmental signals shift from chaotic noise to stable pattern, these cells undergo profound internal state changes, what researchers call microglial state transition pathways indexing environmental input. This isn't about simple inflammation. It's your system quietly indexing reality itself and deciding if you are capable of deep coherence or systemic drift. Our research points towards something extraordinary about microglia, the brain's immune cells. They are not just responding to big threats like infection. They function as extremely subtle monitors sensitive to patterned inputs in your environment. Think of them less like alarm sirens and more like highly calibrated barometers. When the input patterns are chaotic or stressed, those cellular states shift into high activation. But when the context is stable, when we achieve internal coherence through rest or gentle focus, the microglia signal a resolution phase. This transition isn't just recovery, it's evidence that your nervous system actively reads and integrates subtle shifts in reality itself. Imagine your brain isn't just an organ, it's the most exquisitely tuned environmental radar imaginable. These specialized cells, the microglia, aren't waiting for catastrophic inflammation to wake up. They are constantly reading subtle patterns in our world, in how stable our inputs are or if they feel chaotic and jarring. It is like a highly advanced radio antenna detecting incredibly faint frequencies that we don't even know exist until those signals shift their internal polarization state dramatically. This ability, the dynamic microglial shifts, means your brain is always indexing reality at its most fundamental level. Which means something nobody expected for how stable our perceived sense of self actually is. Imagine your brain isn't just reacting to injury or poison. What if it functions like a hypersensitive radar dish? Microglia are listening for environmental shifts so subtle we barely perceive them, patterns in light, rhythm of breath, even the ambient electromagnetic signature of a room. This is way beyond simple inflammation. They track complex inputs that influence state transition from surveillance to resolution pathways. Think of their role as being less like an immune cell and more like a highly tuned barometer for your internal coherence. But some traditional studies dismiss this environmental linkage entirely. They focus only on pathological triggers. Could the system be wired to listen even when nothing is wrong? You need to know how those specific pattern signatures align with M2 activation next. It turns out your brain is far more sensitive than any scanner could ever measure. Microglia aren't just cleanup crews, they are hyper-aware sensors of reality itself. They change their internal state in response to patterned environmental stimuli, so subtle we usually ignore them. Think not loud noise, but the rhythm of stability versus chaos. It's like tuning a radio for frequencies outside the broadcast range. We can map how these microscopic surveillance cells shift from alarm mode into deep resolution pathways. The receptor fires and registers that change. But what happens next is exactly where the architecture of coherence lives. We thought brain health was about blocking toxins or fighting bad infections, a simple tug of war between good and bad cells. But what if we are missing the biggest variable? What if microglia, those tiny resident monitors of your CNS, aren't just responding to inflammation, they are reading pattern? They act like an antenna tuning into patterns in your external reality, the quiet rhythm of a stable environment versus the chaos of constant digital noise. The shift from defense mode to wisdom state isn't random chance. It suggests that our most fundamental cognitive stability might be indexed not by chemistry, but purely by environmental coherence. But what happens when those inputs are so subtle we can't even name them? What if we have been looking at inflammation through too narrow a lens? We think these cells only react when something is broken, right? But the data suggests they are actually environmental radar systems. They aren't just detecting pathogens or tissue damage. They are sensing patterns in our systemic input, the subtle architecture of what surrounds us. Think of it like tuning an incredibly fine radio dial instead of listening for a static burst. The brain's most critical sentinel seems to be responding to the rhythm, not just the volume. This connection between external pattern and internal cellular state is where everything pivots. If this holds true, then optimizing your environment becomes optimization at the root level. We have moved beyond seeing inflammation as just an internal fire. The data suggests microglia are actually acting like highly sensitive seismic detectors for subtle shifts in our reality, sensing pattern integrity before we even feel stress. Think of it less like cellular damage control and more like the deep ocean currents responding to distant astronomical tides. This is how systemic wisdom translates into cellular action. If you can find stability, whether through consistent breathing or quiet routine, you aren't just calming down. You are indexing a coherent signal that optimizes brain architecture itself. The verdict isn't in fixing things broken, but in tuning the environment until your inner witness naturally restores equilibrium. The brain isn't just reacting to emergencies, it is mapping reality itself with cellular precision. Think of microglial cells not as immune guards, but as ultra-sensitive antennae picking up the quality of environmental patterns, the chaotic static versus a stable, resonant signal. The deep realization here is that true restoration doesn't come from forceful intervention, but from subtle alignment. When you structure your inputs, prioritizing periods of coherent calm and restorative stillness, you provide the cellular architecture necessary for self-resolution to occur naturally. It is about tuning yourself into a frequency where internal harmony becomes biologically inevitable. If this idea of environmental indexing really resonates with how input patterns affect coherence, I put some early thoughts on it over at jmthomasofficial.com if you want to see more diagrams showing the state shifts. What remains once we cease fighting the noise is merely the hum of pattern recognition itself.